Welcome everyone to this episode of BRM TV. Coming up, Phil Parker tackles the servicing of older models and I demonstrate brush painting techniques. But first, let's take a look at a layout from this issue, Ella Sweet Factory. So, hello folks and welcome to the studio, and for this section we're going to talk about sugar beet. Now, before we talk about sugar beet, I've got to talk a little bit about Graham Morfoot here, who joins us in the studio today, and you're something of a prolific layout builder, aren't you, Graham? Because let's face it, we've had quite a few of your layouts in the magazine and on the DVD. So we've had Billingborough, we've had, what else, Caroline Concrete Works recently.
Ben Morfoot Peat Railway.
Ben Morfoot Peat Railway, so that was a narrow gauge little peat line.
That's right.
And it seems all of the layouts that you build are around a certain sort of theme in industry. So whether that's concrete, whether that's sugar beet, whether that's a peat factory, a peat works. So I've got to ask the question, because I've never seen anything like this before, why a beet factory?
Well, I was looking for something which is local, which I usually try and do a local, and industrial.
Yeah.
Now, there's not much industrial railways in South Lincolnshire. I'd done obviously the potato railway, so an inspiration came, well, there used to be in Spalding a very large sugar beet factory with a rail connection from Spalding Station. Long gone now, they're actually building a power station on there. So that was the inspiration. And talking to local people, there was quite a bit of information, historic information they could get from local people. Very little published, but as a child I would come here with the farmers with a loaded sugar beet lorries, so I remember what it was like. There used to be 14 sugar beet factories in the country. There's now only 3 left. Wow,
okay, right. So it's an industry that's completely changed, and so this is something you've looked to capture again. It comes back to the sort of childhood memory, recapturing that sense of lost industry and how things operated, you know, back in the day. So
yes.
Talk us through how things operate. So it's a terminus layout in a sense, because you've just got sidings at this end and a very small field yard at that end. So what happens on the layout?
Usually the loaded train comes in through a siding there from a branch line from the main line.
Okay.
Into the centre section road there. The locomotive uncouples, runs around, takes off the goods van, and then takes any loaded sugar vans or molasses or beet pulp wagons away, and off it goes. Okay. And then the company-owned switching, or the company-owned shunting engine.
Yeah, so we've got a little austerity there.
Yes, yeah. J94 comes in, and then that will shunt the yard, moving the wagons to various places. The loaded sugar beet passes over the weighbridge there, and the wagons are pushed up the ramp underneath a high pressure water jet, and that washes the sugar beet out from the open door at the side into a sluicing system and then into the factory.
So these are actually just 16-ton mineral wagons, aren't they?
That's right.
But we've got a little bit of a variety of those iron ore?
No, that is limestone.
Limestone, okay.
Yeah, so limestone is used in the process to, when they boil the beet pulp, to extract the sugar from it.
Right, okay.
And there's an oil tank there because oil was used on some of the boilers. Also coal as well comes in. So the byproduct from the sugar beet production was molasses, beet pulp, and then obviously the sugar. So 4,000 tonnes of sugar beet, which is the average amount per day which came into the sugar factory, would produce 700 tonnes of sugar and 400 tonnes of sugar beet, plus molasses.
So it's arriving as a straight from the field.
That's right.
How's it departing? Is this something that's I guess it's not done in bulk form as it is now?
There was no bulk form in this era. It was all bagged into paper sacks. Okay. Now the beet pulp, which is the byproduct which is used for animal feed, would be in Hessian sacks, or if it was going locally, it would be just loaded bulk into a wagon.
So there's very little waste out of the process, really. You get all that sugar and then you get the byproduct which you can feed to animals. So yeah, it's not just the product of sugar beet arriving in the factory. When we actually think about this, it's everything that's required to process it. So you've got oil, coal arriving as well. I guess it's for the burners and all of the energy required on site. and then you've got all of the products in the various forms going out. So you've got some ventilated vans, you've got your oil tank wagons,
Yes.
You've got even tank wagons for molasses.
That's the molasses wagons, yes.
So there's a bit of all sorts going on in terms of rolling stock. It's more flexible than you would have thought, really, on such a factory.
Yes.
So in terms of the road traffic, so it's not just arriving by train, it's also arriving by road.
Yes.
So I guess it's the same process whether it's wagon or
Tractors.
tractors.
Yes. Yeah. So this is the weighbridge, the roadway bridge. Comes in, obviously they weigh it, it goes up the ramp. If it was a tipping lorry, it would just be tipped out, and if it wasn't a tipping lorry, they would use the same system with a high pressure water jet which washed the sugar beet out into heaps or stored.
It's quite a simple track plan as well. You've got, what is it, four points and 2 crossovers, is it?
That's
Something
right,
like that?
yeah, that's right.
So 1, 2, 3, 4, sorry, 5 points and 2 crossovers.
Yes,
But, yeah,
double slips.
Operationally, I guess it's DC controlled.
DC, there are only 3 inputs into it.
Just happen to see this. What's?
Right, so this is a digital unloader.
Oh right, okay, I see where this is going.
So normally, if you wanted to unload a wagon, you'd put it out of sight somewhere behind the warehouse.
Just behind there or something, yeah.
And then inside each one of these loads is a ferrous, either a nail or a washer. So when you came to taking it off, you could just lift it out.
It's a good idea for your layouts at home if you see this. Just make your little loads as something that's removable. What's this? Just cast in?
It's foam. Just
a bit of foam that you've painted up and
yes.
then sprinkled something on top.
Yes.
So it's very lightweight with a bit of metal on top, and you've got a powerful magnet.
Just a magnet on there.
Makes them easily removable, doesn't it? So that's just sort of a general guided tour of the layout. So I'm going to leave Graham to show us some trains in action and give you a bit of a feel of how this layout looks like in operation.
This is quite an old locomotive, and I thought this month it would be nice to talk about servicing these things. The story is that Alexandra Palace show this year, I was sat at the stand and a gentleman came up to me with his youngster with an old Hornby 08 locomotive, and he said, I'm looking at buying this on the second-hand store, but I'm not really sure if it runs. Can you test it? So I tested it, and to be honest, it didn't run. But actually, the fix for it would have been fairly simple. Now, you might wonder why I'm sitting here looking at Davy Crockett from 1962 and talking about an 08 diesel shunter. But the truth is, when you go back to older locomotives, quite frankly, things were not as good as they are today, and Hornby would stick the same chassis underneath every single one of them. Specifically, this chassis here. This was their what they would call their Ginty chassis, and it appeared under all sorts of locomotives. Old locomotives often are very, very cheap at shows, but they may not be the best option for you if you're running a modern layout. Let's start with the true horrors. I've got a couple of little four-wheel shunters here, a modern Peckett and a 1960s diesel. And if you look at the underneath of them, you can see the true horror of the differences between the wheels. The modern ones are much finer, the flanges are much smaller. Basically, this will run very nicely on modern track. The older locomotive, much as I love it as a lovely collectible, if you run it on code 75 track and even some code 100 tracks, it will bump along the sleepers something rotten. So the first decision you have to make when looking at older locomotives, turn them upside down, have a quick look at the wheels. Are they going to be too coarse for your track and simply not run properly no matter what you do? If you're happy with that, and to be honest, a lot of people really enjoy collecting old locomotives, I know I certainly do, then there's a few things we can look at to get them running properly. You're not going to need a lot in the way of tools. I'm using a little rolling road here that in the spirit of this piece is an old H&M one that I think dates from the 1980s. But the truth is that I'm using this because I've got cameras and the camera guys don't want to chase up and down the table following the locomotive. It's much easier to do when it stays still. A bit of a simple length of track will be more than enough. The other thing you'll need is a controller. I'm using a 1960s H&M Clipper. It's actually older than I am, believe it or not, but it is completely bomb-proof. However, it will not run a modern locomotive particularly well. It's a very, very crude thing, and to be honest, they are 50 years old. The bits inside them have worn, so they're not the ideal tool. However, if something runs well on this, I can be confident that when I use a more modern controller, things will work an awful lot better. Apart from the rolling road, I've got some screwdrivers. It's always handy to have a packet of screwdrivers and a slightly bigger, older screwdriver that you can poke in things and don't have to worry about it. And I'll also be using a wheel cleaning pencil and a couple of little light oilers and some tweezers. They are not a massive toolkit, but I should say what I am talking about is fairly old locomotives, certainly stuff that's pre-2000. Right, now, this is the chassis. And to learn a bit more about the chassis, one of the things I can do is I can download from the internet an original Triang Hornby information sheet. Just do a bit of searching for information sheets for the particular loco you're looking for, and quite often you can find it there, download it. The Hornby servicing people in your local model shop back in the 60s would have had a great big pile of these, along with a very nice wooden set of drawers with all the spares in. But fortunately, the internet at least allows us to get hold of the paperwork. Now, this is a very basic chassis, I say 1960s in era, although they certainly carried on producing them for a long while. The basic idea carried on certainly into the 1980s. This is this is actually a 1978 Ginty, and I get into it by just flipping a screwdriver under the front buffer beam. But again, that's what the information sheets tell you. If you want to get the body off the Davy Crockett, you actually undo a screw that is underneath the dome. They vary a bit, but this is the slightly more modern. There's some plastic involved version, but as you can see, they're very, very similar. The motor is an XO4 motor, and these have been produced in massive quantities, and they actually are nice and reliable. They're quite a nice motor in many ways, but a little bit crude compared to what we have nowadays. Certainly, there isn't one of these inside my nice modern Peckett. However, as you can see, lots of similarities between the chassis, so I'll actually be fiddling with the older metal chassis version. The motor drives onto the centre axle. They've got a worm and crown gear set. The centre axle on these things tends to have no flanges on them, so you can get it round the really, really, really lovely tight train set curves that are so beloved of modelers back then. The other thing about the chassis is it's worth, first of all, when you look at one of these, is just checking it out and following the electrical path. So power is picked up on these wheels here. Now these are an insulated set of wheels. You can just see, probably won't show up on the camera, but there's a little plastic bush around the axle on this side. So there's pickups. You can see these sprung pickups here. And when you're looking at these, just make sure there's no muck or dirt behind there. That's what the tweezers are for. Just have a poke around, make sure that they are touching the back of the wheel, but not too hard. And most importantly, as I say, that there's no bits of pins and stuff. Hornby locomotives, certainly of the 60s and even later, employed something called magnesium. Now magnesium was Hornby's exciting way of making sure that the locomotive really stuck to the track and had plenty of tractive effort. And to do that, they put a magnets in the bottom, and you've got steel rail. We tend to use nickel silver nowadays, so magnesium doesn't work. But in those days, the steel rail would be attracted by the magnets, pulling the chassis firmly down onto the track and ensuring that you can pull good long trains. What it would also do, it would also pick up any loose track pins or anything else that's steel kicking around the track work, and occasionally they would get stuck and short circuit things. So while you've got the locomotive upside down, just have a bit of look for any debris going on there. Anyway, following the electrical path, the power goes in through the pickups and will then go up to the motor through this wire here. Goes to the motor, onto one of the carbon brushes, which touch the commutator, which I'll show you in a minute, back through the commutator, back up through the other carbon brush, and then you will notice there's no wire to this one, and that is because this is a live chassis. So the chassis is metal, and on the other side from the pickups, the wheels, there's no insulating bush between the wheel and the axle, so this entire chassis is electrically live. I'll show you why this can be a problem later. Anyway, having got my chassis and extracted it from the locomotive and just made sure there's no muck and rubbish under there, the other place I'd look for muck and rubbish is actually in the motor itself. They do pick up fluff and dirt, especially if a locomotive's been run on the carpet, and that doesn't do them any favours at all. Once you're sure there's no muck and rubbish in the chassis, just turn the motor over with your finger. You should be able to turn it by just touching the commutator. Don't poke this with anything sharp, because what you've got is an awful lot of very, very fine enamelled wires there, and you don't want to break those. But you should be able to rotate it with your finger and everything should be going round okay. If that's true, then this is a very good sign. The next stage, look for dirt that you really are going to have to clean off, and now I'm talking about dirt on the wheels. So what I'll do is, if I place the locomotive in a cradle, this is a Pico foam cradle, which is quite good. It'll hold all sorts of locomotives with the body on. I can actually clip some power to the chassis, and if I turn the power on and just touch the pickups, I have movement. But I also have absolutely filthy wheels. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a handy little track cleaning tool I've made. This isn't a sophisticated tool. It is literally a piece of copper clad with a couple of strips of brass soldered to it and a slot down the middle so that the two sides remain electrically separate. And I can hold that on the wheels, and he says, hoping that I should get some movement. As you can see, the wheels are fairly mucky, but if I scrub them with a fiberglass pen, gradually they will start to work better. And although I won't be able to bring these up to a high shine, I can at least get the worst of the dirt off them. And dirt is the enemy of electrical pickup as far as locomotives are concerned. It's worth doing this even on much more modern models. And you can see, even as I clean them, gradually things are getting better. The other area it's worth looking at cleaning is the commutator, which is in the middle of the motor. To get at that, what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to just disconnect and remove one of the carbon brushes. And a good thing to do at this point is just to have a look at the brush itself. And what there should be is there should be a little black lump of carbon on the end of this springy thing, and that's disappeared. That's not a good sign. Really, that really wants to be replaced, and there are various companies that will sell you replacement parts for those. But the commutator itself, this is the electrical connection to the motor, and the carbon brushes rub on this, and because they're carbon, they rub off. Again, fiberglass pencil, just a little bit of a polish here, and you should see very quick, very soon, that this becomes nice and shiny and much better than the black horrible thing it was before. It's a very simple thing to do. Fiberglass pen is very good for this because the fiberglass will wear away and it won't damage the metal, but it will pick up the dirt absolutely beautifully. And I'm actually just going to, so that should be, once I replace the carbon brush, that's going to work a lot better. And that is pretty much all you can do. There is relatively little you can do with these things. If the motor is weak, it's possibly because the magnet in it, at the back here, is a little bit weak. That can be an issue, but there are people who will remagnetise these things for you. They have a special machine that costs a few £100. You plonk the battery, plonk the magnet in there, press a button, and it redoes the magnetic charge. They can also sell you replacement magnets. You can buy high strength magnets nowadays that are a lot smaller and a lot more powerful and will improve the effect of your motor. And that just leaves me one other thing, because I'm sure lots of people are saying, well, what about oiling the chassis, Phil? I want to oil the chassis. And it's true, a lot of people do want to oil the chassis, but actually one of the biggest problems a lot of the manufacturers find when they get models returned to them is that people have over-oiled the chassis. To oil a chassis like this, you really want a little oiler, something along these lines. These are both handy little oilers I bought from various model railway traders, and they've got a very, very light machine oil in there. Sewing machine oil is used to what we call it, but people don't oil sewing machines in the same way. Just a drop on any bearing will be sufficient. You really don't want to see very much oil at all, and that will work its way into that will happily work its way into all the bearings and be sufficient. Another drop on the gears, again, that is sufficient. You really don't want to see oil running around the place. And before you think about it, do not grab a can of WD-40 and blast it all over the place either. That won't do the chassis any favours. Worse, if it's a plastic-based chassis, it can actually damage the plastic. So, very light precision oilers are just the tool for this, and one of them will last you an awful long while. After that, a little, as I clean up, and very quickly you should be able to have a nice running chassis. Now in best Blue Peter style, here's one I did earlier. I've actually cleaned up this gingy chassis and polished the wheels up, you can see, and cleaned the commutator, and if I put it on the rolling road, there we are, it's going well. However, I mentioned about live electrics in the chassis, and this chassis threw up an interesting problem when I was checking it over earlier, and that is it runs perfectly well, like this. But when I put the body on top, it stopped. And I took the body off and it ran, and I put the body back on and it stopped again. And the reason it had done that is this little electrical joint here. Now I'm not quite sure if that's original or if this is if in its life this loco has gained this electrical joint. I suspect it has. And what was happening was that when the body went on, it pushed the electrical joint down until it touched the motor and shorted everything out. Works fine with the body off. So what I'm going to do before I put the body back on this locomotive, I'm just going to put a bit of electrical tape around there to cover that joint, and that will solve the problem. And this is the sort of thing you do have to look out for when you're fiddling around with older locomotives. It's an interesting challenge, but very satisfying when you can actually say, I've fixed that.
Okay, so the skills issue of BRM. In this issue, we've tried to cover as many topics as possible to make you a more skilled and better modeller. And one of the topics that you're most likely to come across when constructing a model railway or working on any item of rolling stock is hand painting something. And by hand painting, I mean using a brush and not an airbrush. Now, in many cases, using a brush makes sense because it's quick, there's no cleaning involved like you need with an airbrush, and unless you need a perfect finish on a particular model or a specific effect where you're fading paint in and out like you get with an airbrush, good quality brush and a good set of brushes goes a long way. So today I'm going to demonstrate on this building which I created a couple of years ago for my long-term project layout called Penmaenmawr. This is the station of Penmaenmawr on the North Wales coast. I'm going to demonstrate a little bit of the techniques required when brush painting a model. You can see the front side of it is all painted and complete. However, if we just spin this model round to the rear, which is probably one of the more interesting aspects when you're brush painting a model, is a stone finish on the back of the building. Now, creating stone finishes and painting them can be a little bit tricky at times. It does put some people off, whether that's scribing it from clay, whether it's buying a sheet off the shelf where the stone effect is completely finished. Sometimes you've just got to tweak those effects to get it just look right on the model and tie it in as a whole and make it all look harmonious. So you can see here I've done it in stages so far, from the very beginning where there is the white primer left over from when I sprayed the building. This was a white building, as you can see, lots of render all the way around it, so it made sense to use white as the base coat and then I don't need to go over on the top coat again. I've then started to dull it down a little bit with some acrylic paints, which we'll come on to in a little bit. And then I've started to build up colours for the mortar, and then finally you can see some of the variations in tone and hue coming on there with the sort of effects for the stones themselves. But before you start brush painting a model, it's really important that your model's clean. And quite often people will brush paint a model and then when they look closely at it, or they take a photograph of it, suddenly you start to see all these little bits of dust that have settled in the paint. And it's as important to make sure that you're working in a clean environment as much as it is that your project is clean before you start. Now, for many models, you can give them a wash under some water, unless they're card, of course. But for something that's constructed from brass or from plastic, quite safe to give it a good rinse under the tap and either use something like a little brush like this or a toothbrush to get into all those little corners, because many people have dusty, dirty workbenches and they don't work in a clean environment. Modelling can be quite dirty at times on a workbench. So give your model a good clean before you make a start on it. And once it's all clean and dried, which is very important, you can then start to work around with your paints. Now, I think it's important before we start applying the paint to talk a little bit about the paints themselves. Now, if you're starting to paint a model with enamels, I suggest you do the whole entire model with the enamels. If you're starting to use acrylics, just stick to acrylics and then you don't get any weird effects as the paints don't match and start to react with each other. But as a rule of thumb, if you're applying paint, say an acrylic paint to a model, just be prepared to rinse your brush out more often, because the paint does dry faster, which is great for lead times. However, it will also dry in the bristles of your brush faster as well, which means that, well, you can start to clog things up and then you start to get bristles falling out and all sorts of effects like that, things that you're not really wanting to have when you're painting a model. If, however, you do get any bristles that fall out on your model, well, you can just pick up a pair of tweezers as you work and be as discreet as you can to remove them. So that's the basics of painting and brush painting a model. I think it's time we get started on this model now and actually demonstrate some of these techniques in use. Let's get started.
This is Life Colour's Stone Grey paint set with 6 hues ideal for painting stonework. I'm applying UA784 as the mortar colour with UA913 as the stone colour. Before painting, ensure all sediment from the bottom of each pot is mixed properly. It requires a few coats of paint, but work in a random fashion from all directions to ensure mortar lines are painted. With this coat dry, it's time to dry brush the top coat to represent the stones. For this, apply a minimum of paint to the brush, wiping excess on a paper towel. Gently work the brush at a shallow angle across the stonework, avoiding mortar lines.
Okay, so for this next bit, I'm going to demonstrate a little bit of masking off of the stonework. Now, this is a plasticard piece of sheet which I've cut to shape around the windows, etc., and tried to blend in as best as I could as possible with a little bit of filler just to make sure that those stones continue between one sheet and the next. But looking at the real building, if we refer back to the photograph, you'll note that some of the larger stones, the keystones as we call them, on the corners of the building are significantly larger, and so I've had to let into the plasticard some of these square bits of stonework. So let's mask these off with a little bit of masking tape. Now this is purely because we don't want to paint the rest of the mortar that we've got around the outside of the building. We'll need to apply the paint a little bit more heavily on these than we are with the little stones, and get a bit more colour on there for the contrast. So it only takes a few seconds, and it just goes to prove that you don't need to use masking tape only when you're airbrushing. It comes in quite handy when you're brush painting something as well. And it's basically a question of just following the stones as they go down the building to make sure that they're all masked off correctly and look very close to the way the prototype does. So I'm just going to continue doing this down the building and we'll catch up in a bit. Okay, so that's the last of the masking tape applied to the model, and you can see it looks a bit of a mess at the moment, but we'll soon rectify that when we start applying some paint and then remove it. So same process applies again. I'm just going to get a bit of the paint. This is Life Colour UA 913 North Europe Dark Mud for reference, but it's quite good for creating that sort of dark stone look. I mean, lots of these paints, they'll say something like dark mud, or it'll say mould, or it'll say sand, or it'll say rust. Really, it's just a guide. I mean, you could use it as it is from the bottle for its intended purpose, but for many purposes you can sort of see, well, that looks like a similar colour on something else, and just use it or mix it with something else to create your own. Anyway, let's get started on this corner here. So I'm going to apply a dabbing fashion in this this time round. So you can see there, building up the colour on the stone without overdoing the colour, so you get those little bits of gap that appear to create that texture that you get with stone. And once you think you've exhausted it off the brush, just pick some more up and go around again. And little details like this on the side of the building, which is a security alarm, don't worry about. That's all got to be picked out later in its relevant particular colour. All we're looking at this stage, and the same applies for the window frames, don't worry about those. Just get the base colour on first. Work from the back of the building, if that makes sense, the part that's furthest away from you, so in this case it was the mortar lines, all the way up to the front surface. So the last things that you'll paint will be the window sills and things like that, picked out in white. And that way, hopefully, you won't be painting over things that you've already painted and making a mess. And looking at the photographs of this building, it does seem to be quite haphazard the way it was constructed from stone. There are some bits where they sort of used large bits of stone, other bits where it's just, well, we've got this gap to fill in the building, let's just use these up. But it's functional and it did the job at the time. So just making sure there that I get into all the corners. And again, you can dab off the excess of the brush into the little tray here, and it just gives you an idea as to how much paint you've got on the end of your bristles without overflowing the model as soon as you hit it. So that's better, you see, you can get more paint on there. Turning out as it should do, a little bit more down here. I mean, the main thing to remember when you're painting buildings is that it isn't rocket science. If you've got the colour right, the colour matches, and you're replicating an impression of the techniques that are what you see to be in real life, because you're never going to get it 100% exactly as it is. That's something to bear in mind. It'll look good from a distance, it'll look accurate, it should look convincing, and if it isn't, it's only paint, you can wipe it off and start again. Don't be frightened to get the paint on your model and work it around. So just blending in those areas to what we've already done. And I think it's time that we peeled some of this masking tape off just before the paint dries, just to see how it looks. So let's go in there with our fingers. So there you go, that's a demonstration in some very basic painting techniques. It's merely a case now of replicating this across the building and building up some of the little hues and tones in the paint of the stones there. So Let's take a look now at the completed building. With a little patience, you can create really effective results on a model that needn't cost the earth. Well, I hope you enjoyed this episode, and until next time, happy modelling.